Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. In this lecture, the sun is going to rise on a new age of American history, namely the golden age of conservatism as exemplified in the presidency of Ronald Reagan.
I love him so much.
Now, you would think that Richard Nixon would have put a bad taste for Republicans in America's mouth. But apparently, when you chase Nixon with Carter, you're ready for a Republican again. So in this lecture, we're going to see how America emerged from the long decades of liberalism and found its way into the country of conservatism in the 1980s. Let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
Reagan won the presidential office handily in 1980 and declared in his inaugural speech the new creed of American conservatism. Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And Reagan kept reminding the American people that free markets made free people, and therefore more free markets meant safety from communism. And in that spirit, Reagan sought to bring decades of New Deal economic ideology to its knees. New Deal ideology, conservatives reasoned, was altogether counterproductive when it came to fighting poverty and social ills. Let the market do what the market does, and all shall be well. And so in 1981, Congress followed Reagan into sweeping tax reform, which made deep cuts to individual tax rates. And the theory behind all this was something called supply-side economics. This theory argued that budgetary discipline and tax cuts would massively stimulate the economy. And after a small recession in the first 2 years of his presidency, in 1983, the economy started to come back. But there's a perennial argument among economists wondering whether or not it was actually supply-side economics that caused the economic upturn. In fact, there's another possible explanation, namely Reagan's exorbitant military spending. With a hard-nosed stance against the Soviet Union, Reagan poured nearly $2 trillion into America's defense sector. And while Washington was taking a bath in red ink, the national deficit grew to a whopping $152 billion in 1987. Mr. The government is the problem spent so much on the government that it made FDR look like Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, why would he do this? Well, it was something of a gamble. Reagan believed that he could in fact negotiate with the Soviets, but he knew that he must negotiate from a position of strength. I mean, if Teddy Roosevelt spoke softly and carried a big stick, then Ronald Reagan spoke loudly and carried a ballistic missile with nuclear warheads on the tip. So Reagan played this card in 1983 in a program called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or popularly known as Star Wars. Now, this program, among other things, called for America to build space stations which were capable of shooting down enemy missiles with laser beams. That's no moon, it's a space station. Now, apparently all of this was quite palatable to the American people because they re-elected Reagan in 1984. And soon, much of Reagan's Death Star building Russian intimidation tactics no longer seemed necessary because the Soviet Union had a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev was deeply committed to reform in the Soviet Union in the form of two policies known as glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost was Russian for openness, and what it meant was that much of the secretive and repressive tactics that had long been in use in the Soviet Union would be snuffed out. Perestroika was Russian for restructuring and intended to revive the Russian economy by introducing some free market practices from the West. Now, these are significant because in order to achieve these goals, the Russian military had to be reduced significantly. And if that was to happen, that means the Cold War must come to an end. And in response to that, Reagan said, yeah, we can do that. And ladies and gentlemen, the Cold War at this point is basically over, even if there are a few messes to clean up in the coming years. And the conservative wave kept crashing on American institutions. Reagan packed federal courts with conservatives and even appointed the first woman to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. And once Americans got a taste for this new conservatism, they went ahead and kept electing conservatives to office. And now I'll introduce you to Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush. And on Bush's watch, several significant things happened, like the destruction of the Berlin Wall and the entire collapse of the Soviet Union, at which point exultant fathers all over the nation embarrassed their children with the best of all dad jokes. USSR, more like USS were. And I don't care what size shoe you wear, that's funny. But Bush's celebrations ground to a halt when trouble started brewing in the Middle East. An Iraqi dictator by the name of Saddam Hussein, whose national coffers were depleted after 8 years of war with Iran, decided to go ahead and invade neighboring Kuwait so as to control their oil supplies. Hussein's larger intent was to control the oil supply of the entire Persian Gulf so that he could charge whatever he wanted for oil and grow rich off the world's addiction to petroleum. And apparently invading a neighbor country just so you can pay your bills is not palatable to the United Nations. The UN demanded Hussein withdraw his troops, and when he did not, an international force led by the United States engaged Hussein in war in an operation known as Desert Storm. It only took 4 days to win this war and eject Iraqi troops from Kuwait, and on February 27, 1991, Saddam Hussein accepted a ceasefire agreement. Now, the goal of Desert Storm was to oust Hussein from Kuwait, and they did that. But he just went right back to Iraq and kept dictating. I sure hope that doesn't come back to bite us later. And after George H.W. America elected Bill Clinton as president, who, although he was a Democrat, acted an awful lot like a Republican. Liberal, not liberal. For example, Clinton was fond of saying the era of big government is over. Also, Clinton championed a series of welfare reforms in which he maintained that the government also should not be giving handouts to the poor, but instead the poor needed to hold down a job to qualify for government help. And not only did Clinton act like a conservative, he went ahead and lied like a conservative and got himself impeached like a conservative, Richard Nixon, for a whole heap of R-rated indiscretions with a lady named Monica Lewinsky. And on Clinton's watch there was an awful lot of national sorrow too. The World Trade Center was bombed in 1993, and in Oklahoma City, Timothy McVeigh perpetrated the worst domestic terrorist bombing in United States history in the name of punishing a tyrannical government. The bombing killed at least 168 people, including 9 children, and injured more than 680 people. Timothy McVeigh was sentenced to death for his crime and was executed by lethal injection on June 11, 2001. But even though Clinton could act like a conservative, he knew how to be a liberal too. He decided that he would advance gay and lesbian rights, especially with regards to military service. You see, Bush had banned gays in the military, but Clinton instituted a don't ask, don't tell policy. In other words, Clinton didn't exactly throw open the closet door, but he did crack it a little bit and said, alright, y'all can stick your toe out, but don't get crazy. And so the conservative wave would keep building strength after Bill Clinton and the presidency of George W. Bush, but we're gonna have to save that for another lecture, so I'll see you next time.